Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zou Bisou.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
This is Season 5, Episode 1, A Little Kiss, Part 1. And it's a very exciting episode because it bookends our podcast title. We had the Chip and Dip back in Season 1, and here we are at Zou Bisou in Season 5. This episode was written by Matthew Weiner and directed by Jennifer Getzinger, and it takes place in late May and early June of 1966. So we're about 8 months after the Season 4 finale episode, Tomorrowland.
The episode opens with African American demonstrators in front of an office building. We get the view from inside the building, and we see a group of employees, and they're irritated that these demonstrators are outside. They get it into their heads that they're going to dump some water out the window, and then they escalate to filling a brown paper lunch bag and water bombing out the window.
I'll link the New York Times article from May 28, 1966 about this protest, which really happened on May 27th. I'll put it on the episode page of our website, which is madmenctoz.com. This group was protesting to get more city money for community groups, and the Young and Rubicam, or Y&R, ad agency had offices in most of the building where the paper water bags were falling. There was a group of protesters that came up to confront the executives, and as seen in the show, a secretary claimed their accusations were ridiculous. But unlike the show in real life, the Y&R office manager and vice president apologized to the mother and the other women for the incident.
In the episode, as the demonstrators are confronting the receptionist, we actually see the frat boys with their water bombs, and it becomes very clear to everyone that they are, in fact, the perpetrators here and are guilty.
And when the boy is standing there with water on his clothes, it is such a mirror to their ugliness. Dropping water on faceless protesters several stories below, that's pretty anonymous until you come face to face with the hurt you visited upon these innocent people.
The part that stands out to me, and we've talked about this previously, is I think often when you look at injustices in the past, it's easy to put ourselves on the side of the righteous, that we would have been against the injustice or we would have been speaking out against it, when the sad truth is most of us probably wouldn't be. So I like the realism of this scene where we can see the attitude of the office workers about the protesters isn't any sort of empathy or sympathy for what they are protesting against or any thoughtful discussion of, what would bring them out on a hot day to protest. They just are irritated and inconvenienced by the noise. It's an awful look, and I think even the frat boys themselves suddenly see the human consequences of their prank and probably would choose not to do it if they could do it over again, faced with the consequences.
Through the course of the show, we've been hearing different pieces about the civil rights movement. There were protests in Alabama. There's the whisper of change coming through different facets. Here, in late May of 1966, change is literally outside the door of Mad Men executives. So if they ever hope to ignore it, that's not going to be possible anymore. So I like that Season 5 is opening with this and showing that this 60s culture really is here, even for these people on Madison Avenue. The next scene shows us Sally waking up in a place we haven't seen before. And it has a dream quality. She's got yellow sheets with butterflies. She's walking down a hall alone. And the music is an organ playing a song called Ebb Tide.
Ebb Tide has a very psychedelic 60s feel to it. We don't recognize where Sally is, and she goes and knocks at a door, and we realize Sally's at Dawn and Megan's place, and this must be their new apartment in the city.
Everything in this scene, from Sally seeing her dad sharing a bedroom with Megan to the new apartment itself, and then their breakfast at the island counter, all of this is a new way of Sally seeing her father. It's another facet of this man she wants to know but doesn't. And here he is morphing into yet another incarnation of himself. A happy newlywed again. And Sally doesn't really seem upset by this new version of her dad, but she does seem curious and cautious. And I think it sets us up for everybody in the episode to observe Don with Megan and being curious and cautious about the changes they're seeing in him.
As everyone gets up, we realize that it's Don Draper's birthday, and he's having breakfast with the kids, and they've presented him with the birthday present, which is a badger hair shaving brush.
There's this little bit here where Megan says, "That's so nice, he needs one of those," and the kids smile, so they're pleased. But there's also this sense of how she's new, but suddenly she knows Don better. Also, we should mention this is a new Bobby. This will be the last Bobby in this series. This one is played by Mason Vale Cotton. You may recognize him from Desperate Housewives or his voice work from the animated Hey Arnold, the Jungle movie.
If we were expecting there to be some friction or tension now that Megan is the new woman in Don Draper's life, it doesn't seem to manifest as any stress or tension with the children and Megan. We know she was caring for them when we left off the prior season at the trip to Disneyland. The kids like her. So this seems to be a pretty good fit.
I appreciate that Mad Men doesn't fall into that stepmother hating trope, but I do find it interesting watching Sally watch Don with Megan. And as she says for breakfast, she'll just have black coffee. She's watching Don in his new life and trying to figure out what that means for her. And it is interesting to see.
I got the sense, too, that Megan is a model for womanhood for Sally, and that Sally, watches Betty closely and I think is trying to take cues and understand what it means to be a woman and a wife and a mother. And I get that sense that she's looking at Megan in much the same way. And Megan, in some ways, is very similar to Betty, but in other ways, she's quite a contrast as well.
Later that evening, Don drops the kids off at Betty and Henry's new place. He makes an Addams Family reference saying, "Give Morticia and Lurch my love," because this new house is a castle, basically. The real-life mansion in LA is called the Stimson House. It was first owned by a lumber and banking millionaire, and later it became a convent. When Don watches the kids go into that house, there's a look on his face like what he described to Faye last season. It looks a little like relief to drop them off and also missing them at the same time. And there's this other detail. He says, "Good night, animals," which he hasn't used before. And since Megan called the kids les animaux in Tomorrowland, we can guess that this is her affectionate influence.
We get to hear Jean speak for the first time. And again, it seems like we're in a pretty good place here for the divorced children having a nice birthday visit with their father. If Don is trying to overcompensate a bit with the children for the fact that they're divorced and he doesn't see them as frequently, I wonder if, the grand mansion is Henry's way of overcompensating to say, "Okay, Betty, I've moved you out of this prior home into this new home, which will be ours, and it will be especially grand and really overshadow that prior residence."
The opening shot of Pete this season is the back of his head on the train, and this is all kinds of symbolism for him. We're going to see him this season walking more in the space where Dawn was in season 1. Pete's on the train, so we learn this way he and Trudy have moved out of the city and into the suburbs. We know that was an argument brewing between them before. And professionally, we'll see Pete being more integral to the office than ever. So giving Pete the opening shot of the back of his head here is not a subtle comparison to Dawn in season 1.
If Don is happier than we've seen him and seems more content and settled, Pete seems to be veering out of happiness and back into his standard position where he's somewhat unhappy. And as he gets into a conversation with his fellow commuter Howard, it's pretty clear that these two have been grousing about their marriages previously, and they exchange some comments about how things are going and his combination of ambition and I guess his expectations for his marriage are diverging a little bit from his reality.
Howard, like Carlton for Dawn, seems to appeal to the worst in Pete as he talks about his frustration with his wife and going home later and later. Howard Dawes is played by Jeff Clark, who was in Chicago, Suits, an episode of Fargo, but not the one with John Hamm in it, and the Zach Files. And Pete is expressing some disappointment that Trudy didn't used to leave the house in a robe, that she isn't as put together as she used to be. But let's notice, Pete has spit up on his shoulder, and later in the episode, people are noticing his receding hairline. So it's another similarity to Don that Pete can be very critical of others, but not own his own shortcomings. So, hey, Trudy, how are you in the robe, but also spit up on the shoulder? How put together is Pete, right?
And at the heart of both Howard and Pete's comments about their spouse, their wife doesn't really understand them and what it means to live their life, which is ironic because we don't get any sense that either of them is trying to look through the eyes of their spouse to understand their spouse's life. They have a very me-centric view of things. They don't have the time of day for their spouse, except in how their spouse relates to them, what their spouse does for them, how their spouse dresses for them. It's all very one-sided.
At the office, we find out money is still tight at SCDP, so Caroline, Roger's secretary, is now shared between Roger and Dawn after Megan got promoted. Caroline is sitting outside Dawn's office more often because his phone rings more. So Roger bribes her, saying, "All I'm asking for is a few hours a day when somebody might mistake you for my secretary." Roger has always struggled with describing his value, and now even the basic trappings for a partner are on shaky ground.
And he really seems untethered. With the departure of American Tobacco, he has no clients at all. I think we can see this eating at him. He's bored. He's looking for something to do. He's engaging with the administrative staff. And then the further irony is, from a personal finance standpoint, Roger seems very flush. I mean, he can throw $50 at Carolyn just to try and bribe her to act more like his secretary. All of this is coming out of his own pocket. It's ironic that Roger is perhaps more wealthy than he's ever been and not really feeling the pinch of the smallness of the firm right now. But what is eating at him is his lack of a role or purpose professionally.
The next scene opens with diaper cream on a baby's bum. And I feel like this is kind of the best metaphor ever for how do you know whose baby this is? It's Roger's baby, because there's a bum right there.
This scene introduces us to Joan's mother, and we can immediately see from the dynamic between the two of them where so much of Joan's personality comes from. There is that double-edged sword here where Joan is exhausted with her first baby and learning how to cope and manage with it, so she is grateful and very needy of her mother's support. But we can also see that that support comes at a price, and there is a tension and friction in this relationship between the two of them. And as they snap back and forth at each other, we can see the manifestations of all of those personal dynamics, both positive and negative between them. The good comes with the bad, and they can't live with each other and they can't live without each other.
I agree, and it seems to me that this relationship is an echo of the one between Peggy and her mother. It's different, of course, but the same tension of love and criticism exists. And I find it such an interesting pull between some mothers and daughters where the mothers have this fierce protective love, and at the same time, their ambitious wishes and dreams for their daughters are often what will please the neighbors and make for really good bragging rights. It looks like they're fighting over what cabinet the towels go in here, but really, they're fighting over whether Joan is independent enough to choose where the towels go in her own apartment. And her mother is trying to fight to still be a guiding voice that still knows best when she's helping. So it is a very authentic conflict where there is genuine love between them, but this struggle as well.
I think a major theme of Mad Men is this generational rift, both broadly speaking within society, but also manifested in personal relationships. To go from the men on the train grousing about, their spouses not seeing them and perhaps being what they want them to be exactly, we morph over here to the mother-daughter, and we can see this challenge and gap that's created between the expectations and opinions of the mother for her daughter, and then the irritation and frustration of the daughter that the mother seems to want to, steamroll over those differences and shape and mold her to be more like the way the mother intends for her to be, without realizing that the daughter is the way she wants to be, and the mother needs to make some room and respect it. And these are the healthier relationships, I guess I would argue, compared to some of the more toxic child parent relationships like we've seen with Dick Whitman or Pete and his father.
In the middle of this mother daughter tension, it is really clear that Joan is in love with her baby. So she might be exhausted, but there's no hint of regret or resentment here. When her mother takes Kevin out for a walk in the stroller and Joan collapses on the bed, I feel this in my soul. That fatigue of being a newborn's mother and the pull of having a moment to yourself and wanting to go do things, but also being too exhausted to, it's so real. And it's such a small detail in the scene, but it's so relatable and striking because this is Joan who always has everything together and she is worn out, and that's what it's really like.
When I was in the infantry, they told us that we don't need sleep, we just need rest. I'm not sure that that's backed up by scientific evidence or the experience of newborn mothers.
Christine Estabrook plays Gail Holloway, and you may recognize her from Spider-Man 2, Sea of Love with Al Pacino, Desperate Housewives, or American Horror Story. But she has a long screen resume going back to 1979.
She does a great job as Joan's mother here. I think really nails it and is instantly very believable that that is Joan's mother we're seeing on the screen, even though this is our introduction to her character.
Going back to the office, we get a lot of small scenes showing how people are relating to the new Dawn and Megan relationship. First, we see Ken, Peggy, Stan, and Pete. And predictably, Stan is happy to speculate about why Dawn and Megan are late, and the fact that they're both missing is an issue for the creative team.
In his commentary, Matt Weiner talks about Pete is starting to enter his suburban malaise period.
We also see that Roger is not above cheating to get access to clients, so he's pretending to charm Pete's secretary to get a peek at Pete's calendar. Then as Dawn and Megan finally come in, Megan takes the hit. She says, oh, they're late because she overslept. And with a truth call out, Dawn corrects her. He owns the mistake. He says that's not true. He missed a status meeting, but he doesn't seem bothered at all. He seems really happy to come into the office with Megan. Their relationship seems very happy and positive. It doesn't seem like it's a show. It seems like that's genuinely the status of things.
And this is not really a normal state for Don Draper to our experience. So a bit of time has passed since we left off last season. So it seems like the new relationship is going as well as could be hoped.
Since Don is over an hour late for the status meeting, the partners have an impromptu meeting standing in the hallway. Lane mentions here that he has a lunch with the 4As. Nobody around him cares, but if you notice, you can see he's really proud of this. This is the American Association of Advertising Agencies, and this is going to come up later again in the season.
The subject of Y&R's paper bag drop comes up, so it's clear that's made the rounds of Madison Avenue, and Y&R is a laughingstock for their employees having such juvenile behavior. In order to grind some salt in the wound, Rogers suggests they run an ad suggesting they're an equal opportunity employer. We know the firm is not hiring.
Don usually doesn't have very much time for Roger's antics, but here he's the one who finds it funny. So again, this is a little bit unusual for what we've come to expect for Don. Lane, predictably, says we don't have enough money to place an ad, so Roger says, well, I'll pay for it. And Pete just thinks that this is a waste of time and offensive. So it's funny that Roger and Don are both the immature ones in the meeting, even though they're the most senior partners.
Agreed. And again, I think see the generational gap here. Pete has a more progressive liberal bent and probably is more personally offended by the behavior of Y&R to the demonstrators, as well as being more sympathetic to the demonstrators' cause compared to the other partners.
So next, Dawn calls Megan with the Heinz boards for the upcoming presentation. She comes in and closes the door. I think some people find the Zou Bisou scene awkward, but I'm going to say this scene hits that way for me. Megan voices that she's aware if she's in Don's office with the door closed for longer than 5 minutes, people notice and suspect things, which, let's be fair, with Don, that is a pretty safe bet. So I think she's happy to hold Don's interest, but she's not only focused on that anymore. And Don asking her to open her blouse to him, this is a power trip Don has about keeping her in his office and threatening to make her go home right now just because he wants her. It's not a relationship of equals.
He also seems a little oblivious to Megan's professional focus here. What I perceive as Megan's desire to prove herself, that she's not just a Nepo assignment because she's Don Draper's wife, and that she is inspired to perhaps work harder or do more in order to prove her merits. That's not going through Don Draper's head at all. He's just in love with her, infatuated with her, happy to get with her at any opportunity. Megan seems to like the attention from Don, but it does, to me, make me wonder if this is planting the seeds of some friction and tension that are going to make it difficult for this relationship to endure in the same workspace.
And it's important to note, Don is very proud of their sexual relationship and happy about it. And he doesn't mind if it's flaunted behind a closed door or if they show up embarrassingly late to work and everybody's speculating about why that might be. And generally speaking, Don is just a lot less invested in his work here. We learned from Pete Don had nothing on his schedule today. And when Pete asks him to show up to help out with the Mohawk meeting, Don is evasive. Don's polite. He seems like he's in a good mood. It's just he's not doing a lot of work, and we get a lot of little cues to point to that. So it seems off.
And again, we get this contrast with Pete Campbell, who seems to be the opposite. And, he's trying to get new clients. He's trying to get their creative genius and parade them in front of Mohawk, to bring them into the boat again. He seems to be the only person who's got this level of focus and attention at the moment for this small business, which, as Lane says at every turn, has serious cash flow issues.
Next, we see Megan working in Peggy's office, sitting at Peggy's desk. Peggy has to sign off on these coupons Megan's writing, and Peggy's in charge. She's giving Stan directions, and she tells Megan she can't change the prices. But this is a careful balance because Megan is now married to her boss. So if Megan were just one of the guys, she would kick Joey out from behind her desk so she could sit there. But with Megan, she can't do that.
I feel for Peggy's character because we've seen her struggle with the promotion from admin up into copywriter. This season, she's presented with an entirely new problem. And she's completely inexperienced. So as intelligent or observant as is, she's completely green. And now Peggy needs to manage that and walk that tightrope to ensure she's getting productivity and the best out of Megan, but also not crossing any lines or alienating her boss, who's obviously deeply in love with Megan.
In spite of that tightrope, when Stan leaves the office, Megan and Peggy have this conversation, and I'm so happy for Peggy to have somebody else who's young and interesting to work with on the creative team. Instead of work, though, Megan wants to talk to Peggy about Don's surprise birthday party. They bond over the shock that he's turning 40, which is an possibly old age to them for him to be. And Megan asks Peggy for advice about the guest list. And she reveals Don doesn't actually like Harry, which is great gossip for Peggy. So it seems to go well, but Peggy knows Don. She says men hate surprises, and she references an I Love Lucy episode. Megan doesn't know the people in Don's address book, but Peggy does. And Megan is very confident she's doing the right thing in planning the party, and she's not doing it for herself. She's really doing it because she believes it's a nice thing to do for Don.
It's a great example where, for however intimately Megan knows Don Draper, she doesn't know this about him. And Peggy is dead correct here. Don Draper would hate a surprise party. Peggy gently tries to steer her off of it, but Megan's not having it, and Peggy just steps out of the way of the train. I find myself cringing at this moment because I'm with Peggy. I don't think Don is going to like this at all. by marrying his secretary and having his secretary work as a copywriter, he's cutting a big door into the firewall. Yet we still have no doubt he's not going to like the surprise party.
Megan tells Peggy she knows how to throw a party, and everybody's going to go home and have sex. That's important for later, but for now, this is a lot of confidence from this character, and we're used to seeing her be pretty subservient to most everybody in the office. And we've talked before about how Dawn doesn't really have friends. So when Megan's trying to make a guest list, she includes Dawn's accountant. No offense to accountants, but there's nobody else who isn't from the office on that list. So that is a pretty defining thing about Dawn. His life is his work.
And I think it further illustrates how little Megan knows Dawn because she doesn't yet know his circle of people. And when you start inviting everybody to the office, then you necessarily have to invite people like Harry, despite Dawn's apathy towards him.
Next, we get another scene with Joan and her mother. It starts off with Joan being appreciative of the help, but when she talks about going back to work, her mother fights her. And the argument is, you're doing it wrong. You're going to want to stay home with the baby. Greg's going to want you to stay home with the baby. There's something wrong with you for wanting to go to work. And that's very much like Joan talking to Peggy in the early seasons, saying, you're going to want to act more like this to be attractive and catch a man. I remember you described Peggy as an alien to Joan in an early season because everything about Peggy's choices looked like something Joan would never recommend. And now here it's Joan valuing her work over what the neighbors think. And she's realizing what her professional life means to her, even though it's clear she also really loves her baby. And this is a huge turn for Joan to not want Trudy's path into the suburbs after all.
It really seems to be a major case of absence makes the heart grow fonder for Joan, because we remember when she did seem to have that model in mind where she would catch a doctor, have children, and maintain a household. Now that she's gone somewhat down that path, I totally agree. I get the sense that she's starting to realize just how much her career and working in that office matters to her. And I think especially tied into that is that sense of how important she is to the office and how needed. Going back to her mother in this scene, her mother just can't look at things through Joan's eyes and isn't perceptive to these differences in Joan's opinion and perspective. So, of course, we've got this friction between the older generation and the old standard with the practical reality. And then we've got the feistiness of both characters. So they're both going to bat and arguing hard for their perspective and their preference.
Next, we get the reveal about why Roger was looking at Pete's calendar while chatting with Clara. He's not only meeting with the Mohawk clients himself, he moved the meeting half an hour earlier. So they've been drinking and laughing for half an hour, and Roger tries to have Pete join them when he arrives, but Pete insists Roger is needed back at the office. Remember, one of these men from Mohawk is the same one Dawn met to cancel on when they were trying to get American Airlines. He's the one who said, "You fooled me." So it's probably not a terrible idea to have a good time with Roger and drink up and laugh and make him feel good. But as much as they need the business, Pete does not want to share any part of this with Roger. And most of that, I think, is Pete wanting glory and elbowing Roger aside. But I do think some of it has to be professional mistrust. Pete was okay with Dawn coming to this meeting and sharing glory, but I wonder if he doesn't trust Roger to mess things up after his handling of Lucky Strike.
That's an interesting thought. I didn't consider that. I defaulted to just assuming that Pete is all about Pete and he wants the glory and he doesn't need the competition of Roger elbowing in on accounts that could be wholly his own. And he seems to take a lot of pride in those accounts, which he owns and controls. I was thinking in terms of sitting around at a business lunch and talking and drinking, Roger is so much better at it than Pete. So I would have confidence in Pete to have a focused business discussion and stick to what Mohawk's looking for and how the firm may be able to help them in that and all the rest of it. But as you mentioned, in a case where there is some scar tissue and a desire to find some cement in the relationship that's unrelated to the nuts and bolts of the engagement, Roger seems like an optimal choice to build that camaraderie and happiness.
Back at the office, the whole episode has been building to Peggy's presentation to Heinz. This is the guy Dawn was so desperate to sign in the Blowing Smoke episode at the end of season 4, and now here he is. You can tell Peggy feels like she killed this presentation when she finishes. She hit all her beats, she was prepared. The idea is special photography for a bean ballet. And it's a good pitch, but it doesn't land. The guy wanted something new, but then when they propose something new, he asks about the bite and smile. So he wants it to be new, but he also wants it to be traditional. And I love when he goes, "Ken, you said there would be a bite and smile on the phone." And Ken goes, "I think I said there was going to be a bean ballet, Raymond."
It's a recurring theme in Mad Men, the unpredictability of the client. They are a wild card. They will jump on lousy ideas, they will reject great ideas, and there's no rhyme or reason. There's no way to know or predict it. I love the way this is set up, where I think as the viewer, we're right there with Peggy thinking, wow, what a great campaign. So then to see it fall flat on its face, when Dawn shows up and joins it, and Peggy's looking to him to be the closer here and bring it over the finish line, the fact that Don Draper, Mr. I have no problem telling clients they're wrong or stupid, completely caves and basically tables it and says they'll have to go back and work on something new and the client's always right and they need to work for their money. We can feel Peggy's frustration at both the client rejection and then the lack of artillery support from her creative manager.
And the moment Dawn walks in, too, everything changes because Raymond trusts Dawn. He voices his concerns to him with the ad and he says, "Dawn, you know what I'm talking about." So now it isn't even Peggy's pitch anymore. And Dawn does not say a single thing in defense of it, except when he first walks in, he says, "You said to be bold." And when he sees it's going south, he doesn't do a thing. And as you say, this is not the Don Draper we have ever known him to be. So again, this is another marker that Don is less invested in his work than we've ever seen him before, I think. And Peggy is controlled, but you can see she's frustrated. She's angry after Don leaves. He did not show up for work today and do his job, which was to reassure the client this is a great idea. And I respect her for being honest with Don. She says, "I wish I would have known we were going to meet multiple times. I would have saved this for round 2. This is a professional thing she's saying. If he had communicated that to her, she could have been more successful. And Don wasn't mean about it. He just says, "Oh, we'll get him next time." But I think Peggy is rightfully disappointed. Don let her down.
I find myself, and maybe it's the account man side of me, sympathetic to this idea of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. The client isn't going for it. So, does Don order the client out of the conference room? This happy Don Draper, he doesn't even seem all that perturbed that the client hasn't gone for it. So it's not that he's suppressing it. It is such a striking contrast that, if Pete is morphed into suburban Don Draper, it's almost like Peggy is morphed into, creative Don Draper. And we're looking at the happy Don Draper in the meeting and thinking, who is this new person? He almost sounds like Roger Sterling.
When Pete gets back to the office after his meeting with Mohawk, he's absolutely furious Roger was at his meeting. So he yells at his secretary, and then Ken comes in, and Pete voices his frustration about Roger. And when Pete complains, we're all supposed to be rowing in the same direction. Pete complaining to Ken about this, who he has been competing with since the start. I mean, Pete for sure is the guy competing with everybody most of the time, including Ken. But also, Peggy is experiencing that with Dawn, too. Dawn is not rowing in the same direction for her. And true to character, Ken is calming, he's realistic. He says, "Oh, it's a process, you don't get everything all at once." And it reflects Ken's approach, too. He isn't going to tie himself in knots over work. That's not who he is.
And it's such a striking contrast with Pete, who I think in his commentary, Matthew Weiner says, Pete is bearing the weight of the entire agency right now and the need to grow it. And it really does feel that way. But it is a strange state of affairs where Pete is the one focused and the most worried and upset about the state of things.
In the creative lounge, Peggy, Megan, and Stan are working, and then Don shows up. He's ready to leave, so he needs Megan to go too. So Don didn't support Peggy in the pitch, and now he's taking one of her team home early. This scene does a lot of work because Stan almost spoils the surprise party, and if anybody would spoil it, you would think it would probably be Stan, right? After Don and Megan leave, he's the first one to say a little notice would have been nice, so the party being last minute is a running theme for characters. Although, I wouldn't have thought Stan would have cared if he had notice or not. He seems more like a spontaneous type to me.
We certainly feel for Peggy, who's trying to run her department here, and yet one of the members of that department is at the beck and call of her boss. The other thing here is, as Matt Weiner's pointed out, Don seemed to love Megan's independence when he met her and fell for her. Yet now he's controlling her to the extent where he's deciding what time she leaves the office and when she gets to the office and everything in between. I think this is a major change for Megan because although she was very junior as an admin, she had her independence, and now she seems to have traded that for something else. And I guess it remains to be seen how that shakes out.
But I find that curious because she was never established as an independent person. Of course, she could come and go to the office on whatever time schedule she pleased, but her whole identity was about pleasing Joan at first when we saw her, and then pleasing Don and being available to him and making his life easy. So I never saw her have an independent thought or streak or anything, although, of course, as a fully developed person, she does. But she has presented herself, I think, in the office as somebody who helps, somebody who doesn't make waves, somebody who doesn't create unforeseen problems. As we discussed, I think that's what drew Dawn to her, not her independence.
Yeah, I think she was very attentive to him, and I think that was very important to him. And then when they did the trip, she was very attentive to the children and was doing a great job. I think this whole move for the surprise party is a sign of independence here and her trying to decide something that she thinks will please her man. And we know she's incorrect in this, but that's her intention here, and that's the path she thinks she's headed down.
When Megan leaves, Peggy complains to Stan about the Heinz meeting, and she says, "I don't recognize that man," meaning Don Draper. She says he's kind and he's patient. And I don't think Peggy wants to marry Don. I don't think she wants to be in Megan's shoes. But I think she admires the Don who is about the work first, and the guy who shows up late and leaves early and doesn't do his magic with clients and takes her team member home early. That's antithetical to her ambition and her drive. So it is uncomfortable. She's not loving this whole happy Don guy. And I think we saw this same thing when Roger accused Don of being jealous of him at the garden party. And he said, well, that's the thing about a place like this. You can invite your friends. It looks like jealousy maybe on Peggy's face, but I think it's this discomfort with how has he changed? Is this really a permanent change? She's all in for this guy who's so creative and temperamental. She can handle that. But to have him be a regular guy just like everybody else and go along with things, there's no magic in that.
I agree with you. I don't think Peggy has any romantic interest in Don Draper at all. She admired him professionally, continues to admire him professionally, and she is looking at a stranger now because so much of what he was professionally seems to have changed. I think Peggy correctly is saying what we need is more of the old Don Draper to build this into something. They're not in a place where they can put phasers on stun and flip on the cruise control and mail in that effort. And if we recall last season when the firm went into crisis, Don Draper was the one beating the drum about they'd have to work harder and serve clients better and all the rest of it. There are no signs of that guy this season. And if I were Peggy, I would share her confusion.
When Pete gets home, we see his new house in the suburbs with Trudy. She's still loving to him. She asks about his day. But we see Trudy is not done up. Like Joan with a new baby, she's tired and she's managing. Trudy has always wanted to be a mother, and here she is, leaning into this mother role. And it's more than she's leaning into Pete right now. There's no dinner for him when he's home late. She's going back to bed. She's planning around Tammy's schedule. And Pete is a baby. He wants Trudy's full attention, and he no longer has it.
And I think we can see this lack of focus on Pete by Trudy in the end of the scene where Pete's grabbing handfuls of cereal out of a box in the kitchen. We can see that despite her fatigue and despite her grappling with being a first-time mother, Trudy is ever the partner, totally committed and on Pete's side, even in the midst of all this burden that's fallen on her shoulders. And as you point out, I'm not sure that Pete really appreciates that. Pete is lamenting all the things he's not getting from his spouse now, feeling hard done by at work and not exactly happy with Roger's behavior.
Trudy, like Stan, is tracking the fact that they just got an invitation to Megan's party for Saturday on a Tuesday. Nobody wants to be an afterthought, but Trudy is always cued into these kinds of things. So she's got the babysitter. Trudy is planning to attend this party, so that shows she is supportive of Pete's career. She's tracking his status. But his discontent is so evident, even though he appears to have everything he thought he wanted. Their house looks similar to the Drapers from season 1. It already looks like what Pete has is just not enough.
Maybe Pete needs to be in a cabin slaughtering rabbits for his wife somewhere in the forest.
That's the dream.
Yeah, it's no surprise that Pete Campbell is careful what you wish for, Pete Campbell. You might not like what you get, and perfectly fits this character that he does get what he wants, and he's still not any closer to content or satisfied. So in many ways, he's made huge progress personally and professionally, yet there are never-ending sources of frustration, aggravation, and discontentment.
Next, we jump to Saturday at the surprise party, where Don and Megan's apartment is filled with guests and a band. Out in the hall, Megan is pulling Don home after dinner out, and he is very into her in the hallway. Again, he enjoys this private nest of love he's created with her. And I think we're glad to see him so happy in this relationship. But like Peggy, this isn't a Don we've seen before, so it's a little unsettling. This isn't reality as we've known it for Don.
I'll just point out that Don Draper still wears a hat, and hats were really fading out of common use by the mid-60s. So it really is a marker that Don is of that older generation and clinging to that old habit, because no hip man in the mid-1960s was still wearing a hat the way Don Draper does in this series. And this contrast, I think, carries over into the party, where it feels to me that this is very much a Megan party, where we see the cool jazz band and her young friends, and then the contrast of them to Don's Rolodex crowd of coworkers for the most part, including his completely unhip accountant and wife. It just really draws a line here that Megan is from a new generation and Don is of the old generation.
Yes, the party Don wanted was the one where he takes Megan inside the apartment and he's alone with her and in charge. And this party she planned is a completely different party. They run into Jane and Roger at the door. They're arguing about whether or not they should knock. Roger has destroyed the surprise. And I do wish we had a scene with Megan and Jane because of their obvious similarities vis-a-vis Don and Roger. I imagine that Jane would suck up a little bit and shoot darts a little bit. I do like getting to see all these different groups interacting outside the office. So there's this very uncomfortable conversation between Bert, Stan, Abe, and Stan's cousin, where they're debating the domino theory. And this poor cousin is standing here. They're describing body bags and deformed heads. And he goes, I thought there were going to be girls here. So this was not the party he planned for either.
I especially like when buzzed Peggy and Abe go up to Don and Megan, and Peggy sees fit to talk about how she needs to go back now and redo the Heinz pitch. basically accusing Dawn of being responsible for that. And neither Dawn nor Megan have any response to this and basically just walk away. At which point, Peggy turns to Abe and wonders whether she said something incorrect.
This is a really bad, cringy thing Peggy says. Because she usually tries to be a good person, it feels more embarrassing when she messes up compared to, any number of Pete or Roger's acts. But I think Peggy has this residual upset with Dawn for not fighting for her pitch and for taking Megan home early. And she also really likes to talk about work. And here is her person she likes to talk about work with. We have a lot of precedent showing how bad Peggy is with small talk. And she's trying to talk to Dawn, but she hurts Megan's feelings, and she didn't mean to do that. And I thought Abe was surprisingly sweet to her about it afterward. I definitely, I have known that feeling where I said something stupid at a party and I berated myself about it later. It just feels like a real moment a real person would have. It's not a mission critical error, but it's very true to the character. Peggy is most at home in that office, and Megan is not.
I also find it interesting that if Don Draper is guilty of following Roger down the fool's path of marrying a secretary, it feels like Roger is still beckoning to Don from further down that path because there's a scene where they see the young people laughing and Roger says to Don, you wonder what they're laughing about, and then reassures Don, it's not you. That age gap and different stage of life and all the rest of it is going to create a friction and problems in the relationship that aren't present right now for them. But we very much have this sense that Roger and Jane have diverged and he's no longer in love in a loving marriage at this point.
I thought that was a very generous thing of Roger to say to Dawn in that moment. It was like his birthday present because this is a fairly unique role they're in. They're still learning what it means to be older because they think of themselves as young. And now they're next to much younger wives, and the culture is changing so much. And then, of course, you get Harry, who's trying to ingratiate himself with both groups and failing. We don't see Dawn and Roger talk about personal discomfort much, and Dawn doesn't admit to feeling it. But Roger recognizes it and names it and tries to make it better for Dawn, and I thought that was really kind of him.
It might be an attempt to be kind, but my take was Don Draper would prefer that they were laughing about him because then at least they would be talking and thinking about him. It's almost like a backhanded comfort. Oh, they're not even thinking about you. So it's okay. I'm happy they're not laughing at me. But then that just reinforces this notion of they're not talking about me at all.
There are a lot of quick different scenes between different characters at this party, but there are two I noticed that I thought were significant. One is this ongoing unspoken fight between Pete and Trudy when she says, "It's so loud you can hear the traffic." And Pete says wistfully, "I know." He's not thrilled with his suburban move. And he's not trying to be rude. He's a New Yorker. It's just wired into him. And for a character who's permanently worried he's missing out on something, it makes sense. He wants to be in the middle of things as opposed to Dawn, who wants to keep Megan tucked away from everybody else. The other was this interaction between Ken and Cynthia. They say they're going to smoke on the balcony and to keep an eye out for Dawn so he doesn't catch them. And she says he gets brave and he recites poetry. And he smiles and he says, "Oh, she thinks they're good." And so their relationship seems to be really fun and working, and like neither of them has to fake it or force anything. So somebody has a happy relationship.
I was just going to say, too, I think that's just part of Pete's neurosis. He's always going to focus on what he doesn't have. He's always going to focus on the half of the glass that isn't full. So if he's in the suburbs, he's going to lament the city. If he were in the city, I think he would lament what the suburbs had to offer. So it just feels to me like there's no satisfying Pete Campbell.
We also catch Megan and her friend talking with Dawn, and the friend says how Megan is a good actress, how she was a good waitress, and she got good tips. So this backstory is confirming she's somebody who's good with people.
We definitely see the generation divide throughout the party and all of these discussions and interactions. And it really feels like the room is divided into this hip young generation and then this older and or professional group of people.
Next up, we get the legendary Zou Bisou scene. But of course, the words are French. They're from a 60s pop style called Yé Yé, and the lyrics mean, oh, kiss, kiss. Jillian Hills recorded this song in 1962, and you can find Jessica Parré's version, which was released the night this episode aired in 2012. The song lyrics include the lines, "Do you know what it means between ourselves, a kiss? Of course it means I love only you." So the song itself is a contrast between the private nature of their attraction that Dawn really enjoys and this public performance and declaration of love by Megan.
The scene is really kind of brilliant. The hair, the dress, her moves, everything is so perfect. There's this exotic aspect to, her French. This childish little song and performance is incredibly sexy and hip in the moment. She just exudes this confidence and style as she presents it. And as much as we know Don Draper doesn't like attention and doesn't want attention, it feels like she wears him down over the course of the performance. And looking at Don's face, it seems to me he's enjoying himself about as much as is possible for Don Draper for something so public as this.
Megan is redefining herself before everybody's eyes and ours, from this meek helping secretary to a woman in charge with sexual agency. She's great. It's obviously super hot. But from Don's point of view, the display is awkward, and it's because he doesn't control it. So when Don wants to arrive late or close the door behind them in the office, that's him enjoying their sexuality. But when she calls attention to it in front of their friends and colleagues, he's embarrassed. So it's an absolute power struggle about what their relationship looks like. Jane and Roger have this great exchange. He says to her, "Why don't you sing like that?" And she returns, "Why don't you look like him?" And it's funny, but it's also sad, especially in light of Roger's toast about the only thing worse than not getting what you want is someone else getting it. I think Roger would love this playful relationship Megan is offering Dawn and the completeness of her love for him here, but it just makes Dawn uncomfortable. He wants to be the one pursuing her. He doesn't want it to be equal.
And when Roger voices that aloud, I get the sense that Jane is completely put off by it and takes it for the jab it's intended to be at her, that she isn't fun. She isn't that little coquettish partner that Roger would be so amused with. So we can now see this petty cruelty between them, which is just another symptom of the deterioration of their relationship. Roger also throws in the snide remark that they're all great girls until they want something. Now, maybe that's true of any person. We're all great people until we want something, and it's not gendered the way Roger has it. But I think, again, this is an expression by Roger of his sourness about where he's ended up with Jane. And we know the price he paid with his prior relationship to get to this new one. Again, there's no sign of this between Dawn and Megan, but it's maybe a bad omen that Roger is grousing about where he is on a very similar path, just further down the trail.
After the party, Don is petulant. He never says thank you for the party. Again, Megan didn't do this for herself. She did it because she really believed it would make him happy. Don's confrontation is, "Don't waste money on things like that. Please don't use money to embarrass me." Don thought his mistake with Betty was the lie about his Dick Whitman past, and that was the thing that she couldn't forgive. But this behavior, this withdrawal from the relationship and controlling condescension, this is the death by 1,000 cuts for this relationship. Megan stays in it for a really long time. She tries to bring Don around. Remember when Betty approached Don and he said no once and she just rolled over? Megan's still here trying to make this work. Earlier, she said, "Everybody's going to go home from my party and have sex," and that's what she wants here. But Dawn is denying it to her precisely because she expressed her attraction to him in public. It's okay for him, but not for her.
Yeah, she really tries to argue it from every angle. She tries to argue that people like this sort of attention, and Dawn pushes back that more people feel like him than feel like her, i.e., not wanting to be the center of attention. She says, look, it's just because you're 40 and you're feeling your age. And Dawn fires back that I've been 40 for half a year already. And this triggers a comment from Megan where she says, nobody loves Dick Whitman. And she says, I love you. That's why I threw you a party. And I took that as Megan affirming to him that she loves who he is in the here and now and doesn't care or fret about any of his past and doesn't want his past to imprison him or hold him back. But what makes this moment so painful is I think in Don Draper's head, he is Dick Whitman. And when she says nobody loves Dick Whitman, that actually hurts and stabs him unintentionally in a very profound way. And it leads to, I think, his cruelest moment in this conversation when he says he's going to go to sleep and she can do whatever she wants. And emotionally, it's like he just punched her in the stomach.
Don's whole attitude toward Megan here is what we've seen him be with Betty before. He's exhausted. He doesn't want to talk to her. He gives her the bare minimum of his attention. He's like a king who decides. So Megan ends up wandering out onto the balcony alone and sad. This wasn't what she wanted. Peggy did know Don better than Megan. She knew he wouldn't want a surprise party. And part of you was thinking, Megan and her young friends and the culture are going to be good for Don. He could open up, he could change a little, but he reverts back to Mr. Sulky Man here. And we haven't seen that in this relationship before now.
It's a really dark moment. And as a viewer, I feel so bad for Megan because I'm privy to her good intentions, and they are nothing but good intentions here. So even if we concede that she didn't know him well enough and read him wrong and got this wrong, there's no question of what she intended. And the fact that he doesn't seem to give her any credit or consideration for those pure gold intentions and just reverts back to his own selfishness just makes it all the more brutal. She's still looking beautiful and amazing from the party, but she's just been emotionally gutted by her partner. And this just seems like a really low moment for them in the midst of what had been a very happy time.
And we didn't get to see Betty and Henry in this episode, but we know at the season finale episode when Don told Betty he was engaged, Betty had confessed things aren't perfect. And here, with Don sulking in the bedroom and Megan out on the balcony alone, definitely we get the sense things are not perfect here either. Do you want them to be? Do you really want Don to work out with Megan, or do you always kind of feel like it was never possible for them?
I think the romantic in me wants it to work out, but the pragmatist always viewed it as a long shot and a very impulsive move on both their parts. But I think Dawn in the driver's seat of the impulsiveness, it matters as important as partnering with somebody and not knowing them well enough to really know who you're partnering with. If I have to wager on that, I'm always taking the under because it just seems like such a stretch against such high odds. It's difficult staying together with people for years and years. And when I look at this character, it feels ill-fated to me from the start.
Although some people are really easy to stay together with for years and years.
Well, especially if you're contractually bound by a podcast agreement,
Yes.
basically a hostage.
And that brings us to the end of A Little Kiss Part 1. Our listener shout out today goes to some of our Instagram followers. Thank you, Ben C., Maria C., and Matt B. for following us at MadMen C to Z, and to all our listeners. If you're not a Spotify or Apple subscriber yet, please follow our show, and we'd love to hear from you on social media or through our website, madmenctz.com.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zou Bisou. Visit our website, madmenctz.com, to vote for your favorite sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.